All right, so hello everyone. We are about to start. Just to make sure, on the upper right-hand corner, we have this like two avatars where you can update your information and input your LinkedIn and everything, so you can also get to connect with each other while we are having the conversation. Now, I will start our session, and I'm sure Renee was talking to one of our members yesterday. Dominique, he's based in Canada. He would love to ask you a few questions. I can see he's live.
Excellent.
All right, all right. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you to a remarkable member of our community, Renee Hartman. Renee is a visionary entrepreneur and a leading figure in the world of consumer branding and international business. With a career spanning over 2 decades, she established herself as a formidable force in the industry. Renee co founded the innovative branding agency CLA, where she has helped numerous brands navigate the complexities of global markets, especially focusing on the Chinese consumer market. Her deep understanding of cultural nuances and consumer behavior has made her a sought after expert in her field. And beyond her professional accomplishments, Renee is a passionate advocate for empowering women in business, regularly sharing her insights and experiences to inspire the next generation of female entrepreneurs. In addition to her impressive professional journey, Renee is also a valued member of the Evolve Commerce Club. And Renee, just before we dive into our conversation, I like to extend our gratitude here to our sponsor, AirMeet. AirMeet is a premier virtual events platform designed to facilitate engaging and interactive online experiences. Whether it's hosting a conference, webinar, or networking event, AirMeet provides the tool to create dynamic and memorable virtual gatherings. So let's start. Renee, let's start. Welcome. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Stoked. And let's start from the beginning. I mean, this international career of yours is super interesting. The first time we spoke, I think we clicked, and maybe it's the international flavor there. And tell me, how did it all start? You're North American, based in Sintra, Portugal. So how did we get here?
Yeah, it's been a long, winding road, I would say. I grew up in the United States. I grew up in Florida, which is, sorry for anyone who lives in Florida, but I don't miss it that much, I have to say. But my father is Czech, so he had left Prague during kind of the Velvet Revolution, and so he had immigrated into the U.S. and my mom is American. So I always had kind of an international approach to life, I think, with him. Although he was in that sort of cohort, I think, of immigrants into the U.S. and had like a very specific experience in Czech Republic. And so I think he really wanted us to be American. So he very much kind of, only spoke English to us and had us kind of very Americanized, which I somewhat regret, I have to say, the rest of my life. So I've been kind of trying to get back at that international approach. I went to school at Emory University in Atlanta. I started my career out in Boston at Putnam Investments, which is a buy-side mutual fund, and I was in the equity research group. So I was covered the retail sector, actually. I was very into Nike and branding, and had always wanted to cover that sector. So I covered the consumer sector with Putnam Investments, got my CFA, and was very kind of deep into finance, and then decided to switch gears, and I moved to San Francisco. This was kind of during the dot-com boom. It was during, 98 to 2000. So it was kind of right when everything was like in the lead up, and then also the crash. I went to a company that was bought out by Ogilvy and Mather. So it was a tech PR company that worked with all the startups in San Francisco at the time and the West Coast. So it was a lot of kind of late stage kind of funding, pre-IPO and IPO process. So one of the companies that I started working with was called Asia Info, which is a Chinese company. And they were the first Chinese company to go public on NASDAQ. So it was kind of at the beginning of the wave of Chinese companies going public, that wave has since closed for other reasons. But at the time, there was a lot of Chinese companies that were coming public on the US stock exchanges. So I ended up going to Beijing, and I was with the Ogilvy team, and ended up starting up their investor relations group in China. So I was helping move to Beijing in 2000, and started up Ogilvy's investor relations group, working with people like NetEase and some of these early entrepreneurs. I actually used to hang out with Jack Ma back then when he was at Alibaba. He was like this guy that everyone thought was just like, oh, here's this quirky guy who started this company named Alibaba. Nobody knows what it does. So he used to hang out at these like tech cocktails and things like that. So it was like it was very early stage of the China tech sort of revolution. So I spent about 2 years in Beijing with Ogilvy and Mather. And then I went back to the US for business school. I went to Duke University and kind of, had always been sort of entrepreneurial focused. And I think during that time kind of really got involved in the startup community and the venture capital community. I did a lot of work in with the VCs and private equity. And then after business school, I moved back to China, this time to Shanghai. And I started up a brand with former Nike China executives. So we started up a streetwear brand. We were based in Shanghai. We did I was COO, so I kind of did a little bit of everything, sort of throw you in and figure it out as you go. We raised funding. We raised about 8 million in funding. We opened up, I think, about 25 stores. We did all the production design, and then we ran the stores, did e-commerce. This was back even like kind of pre-social media to a certain extent. It was like the early days of social media. And we worked with a lot of like up and coming sort of designers, like DJs, bands, artists, athletes. So it was a very like community focused. We did lots of events, lots of parties and things like that. So I did that for about 7 years. We sold the company. And during that time, we actually also started up a consumer insights group working with large brands. So we had people like, New Balance and Unilever and these guys who were trying to kind of figure out the Chinese consumer. So after then I left China, went back to the US, spent about 10 years really working with international brands, helping them expand. So a lot of cross-border e-commerce, a lot of cross-border expansion, US to Asia, Asia to US, some US to Europe, Europe to US, and even some South America. I did a lot of work in the tourism department. So a lot of like, for anyone who's been to like Dolphin Mall in Miami or, Ala Moana in Hawaii, there's these kind of, or Woodbury Commons in the US, a lot of international tourists. So we did a lot of work around that. During COVID then, after about 10 years in California, I kind of decided it was getting the itch to move again and wanted to come to Europe, and decided to pick Portugal. So we ended up picking Portugal. I've been here almost 2 years now. Moved the kids over here who were a little bit old at the time, 8th grade and 6th grade when we moved. So now they're 15 and 13. So I've gone through kind of putting them in international school here and getting them assimilated. And I've been really focused the last couple of years on retail technology. So I co-wrote a book called Next Generation Retail, which was looking at how retailers can use technology to innovate for the future. So I think taking a lot of the lessons learned from Asia and kind of the real innovation that's happening over in Asia and bringing that to the Western world. But obviously it has to be done in a very different way. I was just talking about this with Guillaume. We were in London earlier this week, and we were both speaking at the same event, and he's doing live streaming, which I know he talked last week, but that's an example too of like something that worked really, really well in China, but is kind of coming to the West in a little bit of a different way. And then I've been advising a lot of startups and research companies, and just around everything from like digital commerce to AI, a lot of work on AI, in-store, online, live commerce, different activities sort of when it relates to technology and retail. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, so I'll pause a bit, but it's I'm old, so there's a lot of years.
No, you're English is a second language, but tenured, you're senior, but it's amazing career. That's all. You're not old. I before talking about retail, I think your life journey is very interesting, and I think what I'm really interested in is in understanding what's the essence of your work. How would you define it's the essence of your work? I consider myself a connector, and I happen to work in the world of commerce and building the club now, but it's been a life work now of at least 12 years, and what's the essence of your work, Renee, if I may ask you that?
I would say it's kind of more around innovation is probably the key. So working with, retailers and brands, it's how do you spark that innovation? How do you create it within your organization? How do you create a culture that encourages innovation? And I think that is hard, especially with big companies. I see a lot of big companies, some of them will purchase companies to get innovation. Some of them will get involved with the startup community. Some of them will try to do it in-house. So I think this idea of kind of like, how do you really bring innovation to life? And then I think on the startup side is more about, how do you scale innovation and make it successful, right? So kind of go to market, how do you scale your marketing? How do you grow your business? How, as an entrepreneur, do you kind of take innovation to the next level? So I'd say innovation is probably the key, and you can talk about innovation all different ways. It could be, new e-commerce channels. It could be new tech. It could be just a concept of how you do it internally. But I'd say if I had to pick a core, that's probably the core theme.
Innovation as in, like, because you also help companies to expand internationally, right?
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about, who hires you, like founders, or if it's a bigger company, what's the persona?
I mean, I've done both big and small. So we've done big ones like Guess. I've worked with Coach. I've worked with L'Oreal around kind of, strategy for international expansion. So I think for the big companies, and I've worked with people like Away and other kind of more smaller ones. But for them, I think it's more about really understanding what the opportunity is. So first of all, does their company and their brand even work with consumers there? I think consumers are so different around the world. And I think a lot of things that work in one market don't necessarily work in the other markets. So first part is just like assessing, does this even fit? Like, does there even have any kind of market opportunity with it? And then if the answer is yes, then how do you approach it, right? Is it a cross-border e-commerce model? Is it a joint venture market entry model? Is it, I need to control everything and I go into it myself? So is it just, travel retail for one, or is it just about having international tourists come to my store or my hotel when they're traveling, or is it just an online through influencers? So I think it's so I'd say it's kind of strategy driven in that sense of like, what's the right way to approach it? And then on the flip side, on the startup side, what I've seen is, from a consumer standpoint, I mean, I think one of the things I'm seeing these days in Europe is a lot of brands and tech companies want to go to the US. Just because it's a big market. I think when you really get down to it, I mean, I've been dealing with China market entry for years and years and years. China's a little harder these days to enter. I think it's getting more and more challenging for brands to come in. So I think what's happening is you're seeing a lot of brands and tech companies, everybody looking to the US as kind of their main market for expansion. And that's usually like, I think about Europe, you look at places like Ireland or Belgium or Netherlands, like they're small markets. And so the first step, a lot of times people are doing kind of proof of concept in their market, and then they're going to the US to expand from there. So I think for Europe and for outside of the US has become kind of a big draw. For US companies going out, I mean, I was talking to a VC the other day, and they have a strategy that's startup seed to Series A. For Europe companies is all about going to the US. And then for US companies coming to Europe, it's like growth equity. It's like after they're big. So they're already, US companies are not that good at going international. It's not in their DNA. They don't need to for a long time. So by the time they do it, they're generally pretty large. So I think when it's coming outside the US, it's more large companies. When it's going into the US, it's smaller companies.
Yeah, I saw. It's interesting what you're saying, because I saw a founder. I follow this. I think it's a VC kind of channel on Instagram. 20 something, and this guy is always interviewing interesting founders.
Yeah.
And this French founder said that doing international expansion in Europe is one thing, and then when you go to the US, starting with like the salaries. I mean, because they don't have the everything is 10x in the US. The scale, right, is so much bigger. So how do you see that? Like when you talk to people, is it like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was having the same conversation with the startup, because they're trying to go after retailers, for instance. They're like an AI startup. And they said, in Ireland, like a company that's a big retailer has like 10 stores, and in the US, you have retailers you've never even heard of that are like small regional retailers, but they have 300 stores. They're like some small Southeast one or something like that. So I do think the scale is just a lot larger. And even, how you deal with the demand around that geographically. I was talking to another startup the other day, and he was saying, we wanted to go to the US, and we thought we were going to go put, we looked at like where we're going to put an office. We'll put it in New York. We'll put one in San Francisco. We'll put one in Chicago. What they ended up finding is like Miami is where things were really working, because they were getting like a lot of South America clientele coming in for it. So I think that, one of the things that happens is they have an idea of what's going to work, but the US, geographically, regionally, it's so different that you don't always know where things are going to hit.
No, totally. I mean, I know one company, like it's an e-commerce platform. Won't mention much more than that. But when they did their international expansion, like they thought, that they should start in Miami. Like for
Mm.
me, you're starting if you're, if you're a commerce platform and you're starting in Miami, you just want to be in a very comfortable position because there are a lot of Brazilians there. But I
Yep.
mean, you need to understand that, right? And a lot of Brazilian companies, they think, oh, maybe we can start where there are a lot of Brazilians because there's going to be adoption, and that's a big no. And in my experience, international expansion is a lot about ecosystems.
Mhm.
So for example, this same e-commerce platform, when we started their expansion in Europe, like we quickly figured that Romania and Poland were good fits because their Magento was big there. But in
Yep.
Denmark, like the term composable wasn't even here, like in 2017, and this term was pretty much coined by Commerce Tools now, and it's become like a norm in the industry. But at that time wasn't the same. So those learnings are very interesting when you're looking, especially, I mean, Europe is so there are so many cultures, it's so complex, but the US as well, right? It's like each state is a country in itself, right?
Well, these days, I think with the U.S., there's so many divisions within the U.S. now that even within one state, like you look at California, depending on are you in San Francisco or are you in Sacramento, there's massive differences, between the two of them. So I do think you just even within the U.S., there's a lot of regional differences that are not always obvious.
Mhm. We have the first question here from Madalina. She's based in Romania. She's a CMO there, very interesting company, very active in our community as well. And she's saying, she's asking why China is harder to enter. And I'd love to hear your take. I have a consideration there as well, but go ahead, Renee, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several factors. I think China's gotten very complicated. So I think the first one is really it's expensive is one of the
Mhm.
reasons, to be honest. So I think to go into the market, if you want to take cross-border e-commerce as one, it used to be kind of a simple approach for it. If you want to go into say Tmall, it's very expensive to operate in Tmall. The cost of having a partner who runs a system. Tmall is extremely, extremely price sensitive. So they're basically force you to be doing discounts almost the whole year. So you've got to kind of play this discount game while at the same time, having pretty high costs. And I think the market is very competitive. Like there's, depending on your product category, it's not easy to stand out. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of, everything's pay to play. So if you want PR, you want influencers, it all costs money and it's all pretty expensive. So I think that's the biggest thing I would see, honestly, is the cost and the ROI around it. It takes time to ramp up. A lot of companies I see are impatient. They'll go in for 1 year, they don't get the ROI, and then they'll pull out. The second reason is that the multi-brand retail landscape is pretty underdeveloped. It's always been very single brand driven in China. Like even when Nike went in, they didn't go in via like Foot Locker or JD Sports. They went in by themselves and made Nike stores. So it's the market has always kind of worked that way. The department stores are concessions, so their landlords are not buyers. So you don't really have anybody you can sell to unless you happen to be in a sector. And this is where it is very sector specific. But if you are in a sector where you don't have any multi-brand buyers, wholesale is not really an option, right? So you basically are going in under retail or e-commerce. And I think the biggest issue I see is just that it's expensive. The second issue is I would say the market is slowing. So the growth prospects are not as good as they used to be. Even brands that have been there for a while are struggling a bit. And I know you mentioned nationalism. I would say nationalism is a piece of it, but actually not the biggest piece, to be honest. I think the biggest piece is that Chinese companies have gotten really good at innovating and they're fast. So I think take Shein and Temu and these guys who have really expanded outside of China. They're super fast and they move really quickly. So if you're an international company there and you're going there and trying to keep up with Chinese consumer sentiment and trends, it's hard. It's moving extremely fast. So I think those are some of the areas I would say. And then the third one is I think increased fear over government regulation. So I think there is a lot of concerns about getting your money out of China. How are you gonna kind of govern it? So I think that creates some fear as well.
Amazing answer. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like in Denmark, you see this Danish Association of E-commerce saying, "Ooh, Amazon, Amazon," and all of a sudden you have Temu coming in and it's woof, taking the market, and the same in Brazil. And I think you have this discussion about TikTok in the US, which is more political nowadays. You know, like there's it's political discussion. What's your take on this? Because I think Europeans sometimes it's too slow. They don't get the game. I mean,
Yeah.
it's you want to regulate what what you can't regulate, and it's like I think we spoke about this the first time we connected about AI and how much regulation we gotta have, but crime doesn't make any agreement with us. Like crime is always ahead. So how are you gonna regulate those things? So I think we're talking about two things. One thing is China. I mean, they're fast, and while everybody's talking about regulation, they are acting. And then this whole AI and regulation thing. I think Europeans are far too slow, and I mean that's so annoying.
Well, it's funny, like you mentioned AI, like one of the things that's been interesting lately, I would say is, I mean, Europe's definitely highly regulated across AI, across, all kinds of areas, GDPR, even sustainability, these types of things. But what's interesting about it, I think, is like, if you look at France, a lot of AI innovations coming out of France, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's quite a lot of activity happening with France, and despite all the regulations. So I think in some ways, having the regulation, as long as you're able to adapt to it in an interesting way, it can be interesting. I was talking to somebody who does sustainability AI. And one of the things they said is like the way that the EU is requiring you to talk about transparency in your supply chain, that it's really strict, right? And so they're using AI to kind of actually monitor the whole thing. But they said, once these global brands do it for Europe, they're like, we're not going to go do a whole different segment for the rest of the world. So we're just going to go to the Europe standards. Like it's going to be the strictest standards. So I think the same thing happens like in the US with California. Like California has the strictest environmental emissions standards, so that all the car industry will go with California because it's the strictest. So I think what's happening is Europe is becoming some of these global standards because they're the strictest. And it's like too much of an effort to go back and change it all for everybody else. So I think in some ways it's kind of interesting that it hasn't hurt innovation as much as you'd think. But then you look at like, say China has very different China's highly, highly regulated, but in a totally different way. So for instance, like privacy is not an issue in China. Like you can do anything you want. Their privacy doesn't exist. So for instance, my favorite example of this is there was like a toilet stall or like a bathroom stall in one of these public areas. And they found that like they were always out of toilet paper. There was constantly out of toilet paper. So they put a facial scanner in to the bathroom stall, and you only get a certain amount of squares out of toilet paper every time you go in, right? And can you imagine doing that in Europe or the US?
Oh man.
But in China, like that's okay. You're allowed to do those things. So you're able to do things like I did a lot of stuff in the, say for instance, you want to get like a lipstick engraving. You do something online, you put your lipstick engraving in, you walk into the store, it scans your face and you're handed the lipstick. You don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to pay for anything. So it does enable this innovation to come through, but it's because of the lack of privacy controls that's available. But then you go on censorship and information, and that's highly, highly regulated, right? So I think each country has kind of their own nuances, and then you get innovation that comes as a result of these nuances. Sometimes it's more so in one than the other, but it does make it kind of uneven in the way they're adopted.
Brilliant. Let's talk a little bit about your book. And yeah, so you're a best-selling author. Where the idea of writing a book came from, and why did you write a book?
Yeah, I think it came because another one of these pandemic things that comes up. I think it's like during the pandemic, why not write a book? I think like one of the things that happened during the pandemic is when you think about the retail industry, the pandemic really kind of like supercharged a lot of innovation that probably should have been happening anyways, but just hadn't. So like one good example of that is QR codes. Again, one of these Asia things. You look in Asia for years, everyone's used QR codes everywhere. And we'd always talk to retailers about like, hey, let's use QR codes in the West. And they would always say like, no, nobody's going to use a QR code. Consumers don't know how to use it. And then COVID came, and now like my mom can use a QR code. If you want to order off the menu, you use a QR code. So I think that's one of those examples of like, it took a pandemic to make these things happen. Same thing with like, last mile delivery and quick commerce of like getting your food, getting your groceries delivered, everything like buy online, pick up in store. So I think it really kind of supercharged a lot of these innovations. And so one of the things we talked about is just looking at like from the book, kind of the premise was how have consumers changed post-pandemic? What are their new things they're looking for? What are they interested in? And then how are these innovations coming that are allowing that to happen? So I think we're looking at the pandemic as kind of a change event to a certain extent of like, it is radically changing the way we shop. Now, some things have gone back to normal, some things have changed, you know? So I think that like you look at digital commerce, it's not like it's gone back to, it grew a lot during COVID. It's still growing. It's being done in different ways, but I think it really kind of shook up, I think, the retail sector.
Mm-hmm. And so the idea of writing the book was more like to document what you were seeing and
yeah, and maybe a little bit of like self-therapy during during COVID, just something else to focus on besides and I think also just, you know, honestly having a little bit of time during COVID to like slow down a bit and not be running around going to meetings all the time, like I think gave some of that time to reflect a bit and think about things, and did a lot of interviews. So I do think it kind of was one of those sort of forcing mechanisms. But I want to do another one now. Now that I've done it the first time, I'd like to do another one.
And what would that be about?
I think I'd like to do more kind of on the same top. I mean, I actually have a couple of ones. One is I'd like to do an update to what we talked about before, because I think AI has changed so quickly, like the speed of things. You know, when we did the book, we got it published through like a traditional publisher, and it takes 9 months from the time you submit the transcript to when it's actually published. And like 9 months in AI is like, you can't even keep up with things anymore.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I would do another one, but maybe self-publish it just so it's faster to get to speed. And then I also am quite interested in, you know, just different lessons from kind of what we're talking about now, like cross-border leadership and management lessons around different countries and how people are learning from different areas. Because I think that's something that I'm always fascinated in cultural differences and nuances just from everyday living in places. But I think when you think about, you know, how it's applied to innovation, how it's applied to leadership, and how these kind of lessons come, you know, in a cross-border landscape, I think is super interesting too.
What would you say are your major learnings from living abroad and working in retail tech and yeah.
I mean, I think like, you know, in terms of, you know, you think about somewhere like Asia, I think Asia is very, it's fast moving. It goes really, really quickly. The blurring between your personal life and work life is very strong. So you don't really they're not as separate. So for instance, like at Alibaba, one of the things that happens when you become an employee at Alibaba is you change your name. You literally have an Alibaba name, and people at Alibaba only know you by your name. So your name is, say your name was Joe before, now all of a sudden you're Brian, and you have an Alibaba name, and literally people don't know your name besides what's in your company name. Like it becomes your entire identity. That's an extreme example. And then I know people who've left and they'll be like, oh, I'm Alan. I said, I don't know an Alan. They're like, oh, my name was Dave before, now I'm Alan. So it's like, okay. So that's like an extreme way of, but you know, the same extent, like you work every night, you work till midnight. It's very normal to have people want to do breakfast meetings on a Sunday at 7 a.m. You know, it's very normal, and just the pace of life is quite hectic. I think in the US, you know, it's a little more, I would say kind of, you know, you feel bad contacting people over the weekend. It's not as bad. It's not like Europe, but it is like a little more contained. But the US is very direct. I think when you think about like Europe and Asia, it's a little more relationship based. The US is very like matter of fact, direct. And then in Europe, I mean, Europe, you know, I'm preferring to live in Europe, so I think it's got the best lifestyle of all of this. But I think it's, you know, obviously a lot more relationship based, you know, and I think a little more long-term focused and less kind of short-term transactional when you compare it to the US. And I think there's good, you know, positives and negatives to each. I mean, I think the US has developed like a very strong entrepreneurial spirit and this ability that you can do anything. And I think Asia has a bit of that too. And so when you think about entrepreneurship in particular, this ability to just do things and try things and not wait, I do think, you know, the US has cultivated a really strong sort of, I don't know if it's a pioneerism or just an ability to just kind of try things. And maybe it's a lack of stigma around failure, but it is that ability to kind of just experiment, which I think is kind of an oddly, uniquely American trait to a certain extent.
Very, very, very interesting. I always invite our members, if they are willing, to join us on stage. And Dominique has 1 or 2 questions. So Dominique,
Awesome.
join us. Yeah, it's very nice. He's based in Canada. So let me just have him on stage. Sure. How do I do this? Did I forget? No, just a moment. Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah, while you're pulling it up, I'll just comment on Madalena's question about local companies versus like supporting local companies for China. I think to a certain extent it's true, but I think also, you know, if you look at a brands that are kind of enduring global brands, Chinese consumers are never going to not like them. I don't think. Like, they still love Louis Vuitton, they still love Loewe, they still love Nike. Sure, they might also like Li Ning, and they might also want to buy some Li Ning. They might also want to buy some, Chinese luxury brands. But I think there's still going to be an affinity for these global brands, and it's really all about the brands. So it's about the quality of the brands, the stories of the brands, the heritage of the brands. And one thing that, China is a very new market, so it's hard to manufacture brand history. It's hard to manufacture brand heritage and legacy. So these brands that have been around for 100 years and have all this rich heritage and history, you can't have that in China. They're also new. So I do think there's always a place for strong brands. Of course, it gets harder, but I think that I don't think that's ever going to go away.
Thank you. This is Dominique. Dominique, Renee.
Hi, Dominic.
Great people.
Hey, Renee. Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure. Very interesting topic. So I've 7:30 in the morning here. Well, it's 8 o'clock right now. So I wanted to make sure I actually logged in and listened to this. I do have a couple of questions. Carlos knows I always have questions during these sessions. Might as well take advantage of these sessions and ask away. So I've been in the commerce industry, I always hate saying this, like 28 years, 29 years. And my joke of the day is I started at 3 years old. And we were talking before about, you were talking before about commerce, global expansion, so on and so forth, especially in digital commerce, right?
Yeah.
I guess one of the questions I would have is, what would your advice be on some brands that want to have global expansions? Like, you're in digital commerce, right? And whether it's composable commerce, whether it's rather waterfall, so on and so forth, what would some advice be to break out into global expansion? Because, especially in the U.S. market, right? They're going to be strong in the U.S. markets. A lot of companies want to be strong in the U.S. markets. Great, fantastic. And then as soon as they start breaking out, they go into EMEA, they go into India, they go into whatever, they just drop. So What would some topics be?
I think the big piece of it is like building consumer demand, right? I feel like so many times people will be like, they'll do like globally or something, and they'll say like, okay, I can now sell to 60 markets online, and I put it up. It's you can get it in Italian, you can get it in Spanish, you can get it in Chinese, and like nobody's buying. It's like, yeah, you didn't do anything to get the customers in. Just because you built it doesn't mean they will come, right? So like, I think the key is, finding where those pockets of demand are and then trying to connect with the consumer there. I think that's a big piece of it. And that's where I see a lot of people kind of fall down, is they just expect people to come. So I think it does take, I think there's also this expectation that like, oh, I get a lot of press in America, I bet everybody else knows about it. Everybody else knows me. I'm famous here, therefore everyone else will. It's not always the case, right? So, I mean, an easy place to start with that is, I would say, influencers, to be honest, influencers in media. Of like, do you have pockets of influencers that maybe do have, because a lot of times they might have an influencer in the US who is maybe from Venezuela, or maybe they're from, maybe they're Chinese American or something. And actually you find out that some of these people you didn't know about actually have a huge effect. So like one example, this one's kind of an old example, but it's a good one, is Tory Burch. When she got famous in China, it was because she was on Gossip Girl, right? Gossip Girl is what got her famous in China, right? So and same with Harry Winston. They did it. They literally brought characters from Gossip Girl to open up stores in China with Harry Winston. So I think sometimes it's like shows that happen, sometimes it's pop culture, sometimes it's consumers, but I would say like find out what you're doing in the US already that you can replicate in these other countries. So it's not like starting from scratch, because it's a pain. Every market, you're not going to go build demand in every single market. Like, it's just not realistic. But I think if there are some pockets you can take that are working somewhere and then use that to kind of amplify that in the market and make sure people see it, then that can help build the demand. But I think you kind of need to start from somewhere, or start from like some consumer trend that's happening that you're just able to tap into. So this is where I do think like live commerce, influencers, social can really help, because otherwise, like, to go do media campaigns in each one of these markets, it's super complicated. So I do think you have to find these connection points with consumers and not expect just because you have the tech, it's going to work.
Excellent. And I guess if I would extend to that point, we're talking about retailers. What do you think about actual providers, like the likes of whatever, Commerce Tools, Magento, so on and so forth, right? They want to expand into another market. And I'll use the example of US expanding into global markets, right? Yeah. Could be vice versa as well. So are there any points of advice that you would have for there as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I've seen, one thing I've seen that there are a lot of these tools, right? And even you take something like I mentioned Global E, you have ESW, a lot of people who are focused specifically on cross-border commerce. And I think one of the things that Shein and Temu have shown is that cross-border commerce works really well. It's getting easier. Actually, it's funny. I have a client who was shipping from the US to China, and they got to the point where they could ship cheaper from Ohio to China than they were from Ohio to California, which makes zero sense whatsoever. But like on a per package basis, it was actually cheaper. So I think that the logistics are there. I think for the tools, I think it's really about customizing to what you have. So one of the companies I work with, I do a lot of interviews with digital commerce practitioners. And so there was one example that was like a pretty large company that had a Shopify backend, and then they basically went headless with that. And they said like there's constant integration issues and challenges. So I think not every system is going to fit every company directly. It's more about kind of learning what they want, and then how does it interact with the rest of what you have going on. So I think it's kind of I'm not sure I see like a best practice in terms of what to do, but I think it's more about, sort of customizing it. And then I think there's certain markets like China, for instance, that's super nuanced. So like China, people don't shop from websites. They only shop from like WeChat and marketplaces and Douyin. And, so I wouldn't even bother, honestly, if you're trying to go into China, like to do a cross-border e-commerce website, nobody cares. They're never going to use it. So I think it's kind of depends a little bit on the local country that you're targeting. And then mostly with your own system and what's going to be the cleanest and the simplest way that's not going to distract from everything else you're doing.
Excellent. Carlos, do I have time to ask another question or?
Yeah, of course.
So one other question, trends. We're talking about global markets, right? And we're talking about, obviously, there's a lot of differences within the markets.
Sure.
What are some of the top 2 or 3 trends that you're seeing differentiations within the markets, within retail and commerce?
Yeah, and consumer trends, you mean?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. I think one of the things that I'm finding that's really interesting, I think, is you think about like YouTube as an influential point between customers. And like my kids are in international school here. Their friends are literally from Russia, Ukraine, China, Brazil, France, America, Canada. They all know the same YouTubers. They all know the same people. They know the same memes. They know the same songs. So I think in a weird way, like the influencer community is kind of starting to, with the exception of China for the most part, is really starting to unify these global trends, especially with younger consumers. So I think that is definitely where I'd look from like a younger consumer perspective. I think trends in general, the other thing that's, you can't help it everywhere is inflation is hurting everybody everywhere. So I think that price is a huge thing. Any kind of price value, even like we talked about China going with local, you talk about like grocery and just ways that people are kind of trading down and looking for value. That's a huge trend. And I think that literally is every single market has that issue right now, which is just, price driven sensitivity, whether that is changing to lower price points, whether it's changing to, looking for discounts, being smarter shoppers. I think that's a huge one. So those are probably the 2 big ones I'd say. I think you could still argue that within a certain subsection of consumers, there's still luxury is still kind of one of the things, but it's becoming obviously a smaller and smaller more segment. And I think that group is getting more and more, like they're more willing to spend, they're more willing to pay for experiences, they're more willing to pay for things, but it's a very small subsegment, whereas the bottom is getting bigger, middle's being scrunched, and that top is getting more to the top, but it's like there's more interest in that sector. So if those are kind of like generic ones I'd give.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just stay on, Dominique, and thanks for your questions. I think it's very interesting to observe our children's behavior, and this is an exercise I did with my father a few years ago. My father sells dress shirts, and he started his career on television, like one of those American shows where a reporter kind of would interview you, and you would sell live before Instagram in the 90s. Yeah. And at some point he was like saying, nobody, but that was in 2013, 14. And we were having this argument like about social media. And I said, all you have to do is to look at my cousins. At the time they were 13 or 14. Just look at how they are. Everybody has a phone and they communicate there, and they're going to be future consumers, right? So observing how the young generation, and to your point, I think YouTube is massive. My kids, 11 and 9, they watch YouTube all the time.
Yeah.
And you can see, like, you can start spotting so many influencers there and trends, right? So I think this is really interesting, just to observe. It's like,
Yeah. I mean, I think like look at Mr. Beast. I think Mr.
Yeah.
Beast, every kid watches Mr. Beast, and a lot of adults do. I think he's available in like 60 some languages. It's insane. So he's got like way more languages available than Netflix does. So when we were growing up, like we all had regional media. So I knew what happened on American media. Other people knew what happened on Brazilian media. We didn't have these cross, country media channels. And I think YouTube has really unified that. They all know Logan Paul. They're all into Prime. They're all into these things that it doesn't matter what country you're in. If you're of a certain age group or of a certain customer segment, you literally know this no matter what country you're at. So I think it's even, you think about like football as probably being one of the most unifying, topics. I think, you look at like who's the biggest Instagram following, it's all like footballers. But I think these YouTubers are like, have almost gotten more so than the celebrities and the artists, because the athletes, because they just have been able to amass this huge following and everybody knows them.
very nice. I'm also inviting Ben. Ben is based in London. He's based in the UK. Renee, she left the stage for "It Wasn't Me." Isn't there a song that says "It wasn't me"? So let's just wait.
How many people can you have on stage?
I don't know. I have to ask the Air Meet guys.
Maybe I should leave the stage. Maybe give.
No, you can stay on. It's fine. Ben, welcome. We just need to wait for Renee to return.
Hello, can you see me? This is my first time doing this. So
very cool.
Around it all.
Looking good.
Thanks. Nice to see you all. Thanks for this.
Indeed.
It's been a great chat so far.
Awesome. All right. So Renee, this is Ben. Ben is
Hey,
based
Ben.
in London.
Hello. Hi. Quick intro for those who don't know me. I work in talent from an inclusivity DEI perspective. I've worked in the fashion and retail industry for coming up to 20 years. Across international markets, and when I'm listening to a lot of what you're saying, I'm always going back to a question of thinking ahead for businesses. What are the main skills that businesses should be thinking about engaging with from a talent perspective? But equally, as businesses evolve, often leaders don't evolve with them. So actually the development of skills to ensure they're future-proofing the business are always things that I'm kind of curious to understand when you're then building out pipelines and that side of things.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's funny, I've been having this conversation a lot because of AI, right? So take AI as an example, and it's like, how do you bring AI into the organization? And there's so many people who are like, it's weird because what I've heard people say recently is like young people in their 20s are really open to AI, and older people are really open to AI, but there's like group in the middle of like 30, because I was talking to somebody, I'm in my late 40s, and I was talking to somebody who was like early 30s, and they were like, oh, I'm too old to do AI. I can't do this right now. And I'm like, really? I can do AI. Why can't you do it? You're not too old. It's like, first of all, AI is easy. Like, I don't know what's so hard about this. And I think there's this idea of like, are you open to new skills and open to trying new things? Because I think, the old way of doing stuff is changing so rapidly now. So I think it's really more about a mindset. It's not about like your age. It's more just this mindset of trying new things. And I talked to a lot of people about digital commerce, and same thing, like CPG companies that they'll say like, oh, we offer digital training to everybody, but it's voluntary and only some people do it and some people don't do it. So then you have these like really uneven trainings that are happening within the organization. And it's sort of this like, I don't want to do this new thing. It's going to be difficult. So I think that like now, what I hear people say about AI is like, AI is not going to take your job, but somebody who uses AI is going to take your job, right? So I think this ability to like be open to new things and to be willing to try things and, try things out, assess them, what I always tell people when I talk about AI is like, be the AI champion in your company, because that's going to make your career, honestly, right? If you're the one sitting there in the corner, not adopting it, not changing it, why not be the person who's willing to try all these new tools and test them out? That's what's actually going to get you ahead in your career. So I think it's more about mindset and this just ability. It's not like training and learning, because what's unique about AI is it's actually not that hard. Like, you don't have to learn how to code. It's not a skill really. It's just more about testing and trying and being open to that.
And it's also, I completely agree. And even with the AI as well, I see a huge opportunity to enable more human experiences by removing some of the things that get in the way of organizations actually connecting with customers.
Yeah.
And the other part of my work is around environment and actually how do you create this the physical space that welcomes people into a store, whether it's digital or physical.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that would be my only other question is around attracting customers in, especially Gen Z customers who have completely different habits and really embracing what they bring into the market.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like I've been talking to a lot of VCs about AI and retail, and the two things that everyone has said the same thing of is nothing truly revolutionary has happened yet in terms of how you shop, right? In the sense that majority of things that have happened are efficiencies. There's some, I think it is actually, to be honest, I think it is starting to change the way you shop online. I think the way things are going, conversational commerce and the way you can do product recommendations and bringing that sense of offline discovery to online is starting to change. But in store, I really haven't seen much. Like I've seen some analytics. I was at Viva Tech a couple of weeks ago, and they showed LVMH is doing some kind of fun things where they're doing like an example. They had like an AI sommelier, like wine sommelier, and it was like a painting that would talk to you. It had like a mouth that moved, and you could go and like ask it questions about like I'm looking for a red to pair with steak. What should I do? And it would talk back to you. And there's some of these. They also had other ones where you could like talk to a piece of art and you could say like, what are you trying to show people? Like, how are you made? So they're trying to get there. I've seen a lot more with AR, VR, I would say, like taking like perfume and saying like, we're going to take you through like sensorial journeys of the different aspects of the perfume. So I've seen some of it happen in the consumer experience, but I don't think it's really like where it needs to be yet. It does feel a little more gimmicky and less like kind of inherent into your overall experience. And I think people are still trying to figure out what that is. And I think that's why the VCs say like, because what they say is they say like, Amazon truly changed the way you shop. Like it was a truly revolutionary company that really changed how things do. And they said for AI in retail, not yet. I haven't seen anything like that yet.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Very cool. So we have now Fernanda. Can you understand a little bit of what we are building with Evolved? So it's never just a one person talking, but it's a forum really. And that's the spirit. So Fernanda is a former Nike, amazing career as well. Fernanda, welcome. And please ask your questions.
Thank you. Never a dull moment here.
Never.
Thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge and your experiences. And I would like to hear a little bit about the future. What do you see coming up, especially here in Europe? Because I see that the rhythm is very different from other markets that I had the opportunity to work with. And I also see that consumers here are a little bit more conservative, especially if we talk about like early 30s, mid 40s. They are still looking for that old shopping experience in stores, like, the same brands, the same retailers. So do you see like a big shift happening here in Europe very soon, or do you think that's the rhythm that we are going to see for a while? And also, if you think that the political situation that we are facing here in Europe will have some kind of impact on the way that people shop.
I mean, I think they're both really good points. And it's funny because I moved here from the US to Europe 2 years ago, and my online shopping is way down. In the US, I'd used Amazon for everything. I had constant packages at the front of my house. Here, I rarely do, I have to say. Like I always go out to stores. I find the digital commerce experience here slow and it's like a little bit difficult. I just find it harder. Like even Amazon, I'm in Portugal, so maybe that's part of it. But it takes me, a week to get things from Amazon. It's long. It's not an easy process. There's lots of steps. So I even actually just ordered from Temu and had it delivered in Portugal, and it was like 10 days. So I'm even gotten to the point where I'm like, honestly, it's not that much faster to buy it from Europe. I just as soon go buy it from Temu. So I do think that's changed. That is still kind of slow. I think that I agree with you that people prefer going in store, and it is more of like an experiential idea. I think that where Europe has a benefit from, I think overseas is really these brand experiences, right? Like when you think about like a lot of the French brands and like some of the really, in Spain, I think when you think about like WOW concept, even El Corte Inglés, like some of these experiences are much better, honestly, like having Michelin star restaurants and the sort of in-person experience. But I'm not seeing technology integrated into it too much yet, I have to say. They're still a little bit more old school. Probably, honestly, some of the best examples are like IKEA when you're using your app to go through Decathlon, where you can just like, I don't know if they have them there, but the bins where you just kind of put everything in for purchase. I am seeing in Europe, I think, is it more advanced and automated stores. And I think it's maybe labor cost, honestly. So I think because the labor costs are higher, it's more difficult. I see a lot of like just walk out technology. I see a lot of, I've been in several stores that have no staff, you know, and you just go in, like, especially in airports. You know, I went to a duty free one in Belgium that has none. Ireland has several. So I actually find the vending machines automated and unstaffed, I think, is more advanced in Europe than in the US, I would say. The other thing is, I think the regional differences, like grocery, for an example, right? Like grocery, because it's so regional, in some ways it allows them to experiment a little more. So like one, it's kind of a boring example, but like the electronic shelf labels, which is basically allows you to have dynamic pricing. So you could have an electronic shelf label that will change your pricing, and that could be AI optimized. So like your produce is about to go bad, you would normally mark the price down. You could use an AI algorithm to bring it down. One of the advantages I've seen in Europe is they say our store footprint is smaller, so we can invest in more technology. Because if you put that in Walmart, like buying electronic shelf labels for every Walmart, it's like it's not feasible. So in the US, I see people saying like, no, it's too costly. But here, because they're not that many stores, they are smaller. I think they're more interested in kind of upping the experience, and so they're willing to invest in technology a little bit more here. So I think that's maybe an advantage. The other big difference I see here, which is kind of interesting compared to the US, is retail theft is a huge problem in the US right now. So everything, like if you go into like a CVS, everything's locked. You can't even get a deodorant. Like everything's behind locked gates and everything. So I think that in Europe, it's a little bit easier that way. So they're a little unencumbered by some of that. And then the political question, I don't know. That's a really good question, I think. I honestly don't know. I do think it's probably, you know, I can tell you Brexit, like when you think about the tourism market and like VAT tax-free shopping, it's definitely Brexit definitely affected the UK. I think when you look at international shoppers coming, they're especially people from China, they will come to the EU specifically because of VAT shopping. Like that is actually one of their big drivers. So I think that has hurt them. And I do think the idea of like just being less accessible internationally is probably a net negative. But I don't know how, honestly, I don't know. I'd be curious what you guys think. I don't know how it's going to affect the shopping experience directly. I mean, you assume it's going to make it more regional and less international, but I don't know, maybe sometimes that's good for the shopping experience. What do you guys think?
So I think immediately what we are seeing right now is the riots, right? Taking
Yeah.
like massive proportions. And I think, of course,
Yeah.
this scare people away, especially
Yeah.
if you are not original from here. So
Yeah.
this can be very serious, besides all the damage that the retailers will have to pay for it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is like the immediate effect. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure if all these riots and all these, like, being on the headlines everywhere will alert people from outside of Europe, especially in places where we see that the riots are more aggressive, like in France, if that is not going to create an awareness of a more concerning situation, that it's not so clear for people who does not live here,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
I mean, that's
I'm not
exactly
sure.
what
I'm
happened
still
in the
waiting to
US.
see.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened in the U.S. I mean, during COVID, there was a lot of riots, a lot of theft, like people just breaking into stores and stealing things. And so now there is even in the U.S., actually the perception of how bad theft is worse than it actually is. People think it's horrible,
really?
horrible, horrible. It's actually not as bad as people think, but the perception is that it's horrible, it's unsafe. They've closed down stores in the middle of San Francisco because of it. And international, tourists are concerned about it. I mean, there are other issues with guns and other things in the U.S. that I won't get into, which also contribute to that. But definitely we see people not going to the U.S. because of safety. So I do think it's a consideration.
It's a good
Yes,
opportunity
I
for the
lived
actual
in
digital marketplace. Like in Europe, right? It's a good opportunity for the digital marketplace to actually take a step up, right? Because experience shopping in Europe is always different than the US, obviously. They like the touch, they like the feel, they like the see, and so on and so forth, right? But I think with the climate structure, which again, to your point, Renee, it's always worse when you're outside of it than you're inside of it, right? But I think digital marketplace is a great area to expand there, because if people are listening to the news and say, no, we can't go there, but we still want this item, we still want this article, we still want this food item, it's a good opportunity to take fold.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, what I see here is that shopping, especially in fashion, that is my field, it's never just shopping. It's like shopping, getting with your friends, having a coffee outside, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a broader experience. I lived in United States for almost 4 years, and in United States, shopping is shopping because you want to
Exactly.
buy something, right? And here is like this broader experience
Yeah.
that includes so much more. And that's why I think digital here loses space, because it's hard to offer all of that. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think Asia is a good example of that, because Asia is exactly the same. Like, that's what you do for entertainment. You go shopping, you go on dates there, you meet your friends, you go there after work. Like, that is your experiential place. And I totally agree with you. The US is more transactional. It's more about like running errands. I need to go buy this, I need to go buy that, which is easier to replace by online, because it's like I have to go buy some shoes for my kids. I may as well buy them online instead of having to go to the store. But I think that where the opportunity for digital and tech is how can you bring that experience that you're having offline, how do you bring it online? And nobody's figured that out yet, I don't think. But it's that idea of like, when I go to a store, I'm not going in saying like, I need a black shirt right now. That's all I'm looking for. And that's what you do online. You go and type in black shirt, or you look at like new arrivals. You don't have this like, I'm just experiencing it in real life and having this sense of discovery of like, what do I see that's interesting? And I bought something that I didn't think about. I saw one example recently that's a French startup actually, and they were doing like kind of like inclusive outfits, where they would basically put like, you pick the body type, and then they would like move tops and bottoms together. And it's funny because I was watching it and I was looking at it and I was like, some of the outfits that look good on this girl, like I would never have picked in a million years. Like a green suit looked really good on her, but I'm like, I would never ever buy a green suit or look for that. But actually it looked pretty good on her. So maybe I should consider these things. So it was like this, it was something new I had seen that I hadn't seen. That was like a very visual way of like, how do I look online and just try see what's out there without me having to go search for it and look for it and do the work myself.
Very cool. Renee, we are on now 56 minutes, and I have a question. Maybe to wrap this up, I don't want to dictate when we are wrapping up, but we are almost there. And it's more like being an advisor, which you are now. And when we look at your LinkedIn, you're sitting on several companies as an advisor. So the first question I have is, what are the advantages that you see in being an advisor, being touching so many tech companies and talking to so many people? And then, what's your take on how do you become an advisor?
I mean, I think I've been working on kind of this advisor, approach for a little while. And I think what attracts me to it is being involved with a lot of different companies and getting that experience. And I honestly really just enjoy working with founders. I find founders really interesting. I think they're passionate. They have a lot of ideas, and it's about kind of bringing it to life. And I think being a founder myself in the past and going through the ups and downs of running a business, I also often find that, they'll kind of confide in me of like, I wouldn't tell anybody else this, but here, I'm worried about my cash flow, or how am I going to make payroll next week? So those types of things, I think it is nice to have somebody you can talk to about that, and kind of really, get involved. And I think for me personally, one of the challenges I have, and this is something I think is doing versus advising, right? I've been a consultant for a long time. I'm used to doing things. So this switch from doing to advising, it's a little bit, for me, I'm still kind of working through sometimes where the line is, right? I have my innate sense is to do stuff to help people, but you realize to be on advisor boards and do a lot of this stuff, you shouldn't get too involved. You should really it's like, how do you teach them to fish versus go fish for them, right? So I think that's sometimes that for me, that challenge can be a little bit tough because it's harder to separate. But I think that's the goal. I think is to help these companies at a higher level and strategic approach versus like actually doing everything. Because I find that I enjoy being involved in a lot of different things and a lot of different innovations, and you can't do all of them. And so there's just only so many hours in a day sometimes.
Yes. And how do you become an advisor? If you could advise us, and we have very senior people here. I think it's one of the questions that I got yesterday, and I would love to know.
I think it's, it's funny. I've met more and more people who I think particularly people who are senior, who are kind of looking at like the next, off ramp of like, am I going to keep doing this for another 10 years, 15 years, or what else am I going to do? And I think, I think the best advice, which is the most boring advice that everybody tells you, is to network and find people, that you want to engage with. I have found, just for me, meeting a lot of startups has been helpful, just to learn what their problems are. I've met with a lot of VCs as well, and just trying to get a sense of like, what are the challenges people have? And I think I was talking to a VC the other day, and he said, like, I have one portfolio company that has all the right problems. Like, they're trying to scale, they're doing so well, they can't keep up with things. And he's like, then I have another portfolio that has all the wrong problems. Like, their product's not working. But they both need help, but for very different reasons they need help. So I think it's kind of like figuring out what your niche is of what types of help people need, which, some things I see a lot of are like sales is a huge one for these startups. I think is a big issue always. Fundraising, marketing, branding, positioning. So I think figuring out what your niche is, and then finding the right people that you can kind of create a create a match with.
Brilliant. Brilliant. All right. Renee, I think this was amazing. How did you feel about this experience? Let's call it.
No, it's good. It's been
experience.
fun. It's fun to have so many different. It's a different type of experience I have. Usually, it's just like an interview, so it's fun to have different people involved.
Yeah.
And I know we didn't get to all the questions, so if anybody has, if anybody wants to reach out and chat about things, they all are like super interesting topics that I'd love to chat about more.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time. Everyone who's joined us today, thank you. Thank you for your time. And yeah, that's the Evolve Club. And thank you. Thank you for this wonderful afternoon or morning, whatever you are in the world. All right.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, it's nice to meet everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.